Hello again. So we're still talking about self-identity and social identity. And in this lecture, we're going to talk about power relationships because these identities that we've been discussing are socially constructed for the most part. I mean, there are some physical characteristics that are used in the social construction in some cases and biological characteristics that are used in the definitions in some cases, but power relationships develop usually based on these social identifying categories that we've been talking about and that we will be talking about in future lectures. So in social sciences, sociology, cultural geography, these kinds of social sciences, we talk a lot when we discuss power relationships about dominant categories of people in society versus subordinate categories of people in society. So you might be more familiar with the word majority versus minority because those words tend to mean the powerful are the majority and the less powerful or the voiceless are the minority. But we need to really, as educated individuals, steer away from majority and minority classifications because they imply numbers of people in a population. And the dominant or the most powerful category of people in society is not always the most numerous category of people in society. Case in point, South Africa, the nation of South Africa, on the continent of Africa, especially in the 1990s when the apartheid system was in place, and before the 1990s when the apartheid system was in place. The dominant group were immigrants to the area that took over, and they were not at all the majority of the population. They were just in control. So the dominant group is in control, whereas the subordinate group falls underneath that control. And so these ethnic groups, racial groups, sexual categories, gender categories, and other issues like language and religion that we're going to look at in the future, economic categories, these are all characteristics that can contribute to your self-identity, to your group's social identity, and it creates a place within the social climate, within the cultural makeup. It creates a place for you and your category of people and the relationship that that category of people has to the dominant group in society. So, dominant is the most powerful. Subordinate is any category of people that is subjected to the dominant group, okay? So I'm going to use patriarchy as an example. Patriarchy because it is a macro scale organizational system of power that is the most common social organization in the world, okay? So patriarchy means that males are the dominant group in society. Males in a patriarchy control access to resources, they control governance and lawmaking, they control inheritance systems and things like this in a traditional patriarchy. Now, patriarchy is a word that sometimes people use it like very aggressively and say, oh, patriarchy is bad. I am not telling you patriarchy is bad. Society has to have some kind of organizational structure. Patriarchy happens to be the most common type of organizational structure in the world. It's not just a USA thing, and nobody is to blame for it. If you happen to be male, you don't feel advantaged necessarily, and you might not be on a personal level. But patriarchy is the most common social organization in the world. There are matriarchal societies where females are have the dominant role in the social setting. But in patriarchies, males have the most dominant roles in the social settings, not the domestic part, which is the female's realm in a patriarchy. So, my patriarchy example is more than just about your maleness or your otherness, whoever is non-male being a subordinate. Particularly the type of patriarchy that we have in the United States has other ethnic, racial, and social characteristics that are markers of the dominant group. So for instance, I should have written this on the board before we began. Let me see if this marker works. But in the United States, you might have heard of a category of people called WASPs. This is an abbreviation. This represents a racial category, an ethnic category, and a religious category all rolled up into one. So white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant is what WASP represents. The word WASP means white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestants. So in the patriarchy that we live in the United States, if you are male, white, with English descent, Anglo-Saxon, these are the two tribal groups that populated England, Wales, Scotland, I guess you'd call it ancient times in like the 400s AD, for instance. So white Anglo-Saxon or British origin people who are Protestant, meaning not Catholic. I referred to myself a couple videos ago as a Catholic individual. And so Protestant is any type of Christianity that is not Catholic, because the original form of Christianity on the planet was Catholic. And Henry VIII, as you might know, Anglo-Saxon, Henry VIII broke away from the Catholic Church and began a Protestant. He protested against the Catholic Church. He began a Protestant form of religion in England. And other people like Martin Luther broke away from the Catholic Church and began a Protestant form of religion. John Calvin broke away from the Catholic Church and developed protested against the Catholic religion. So that's what the P stands for, Protestant. So Christian, but not Catholic Christian. So this is the particular collection of social identity markers that make up the patriarchal dominant group. So if you are a male in a patriarchy, you are the most advantaged sex category. But in our particular society in the United States, white males who are not simply white by later definitions, such as there's a book called When the Irish Became White. It had to do with their Catholic nature. It's an interesting history book. You could check it out. But anybody who was from the Iberian Peninsula, which is Spanish, maybe today we might call them white, or French, they were Latins. The French were considered Latins, like Latin America, again, to the Catholic heritage. So they were not Anglo-Saxons, the Kells, for instance, the Celtic for in Ireland, or the Franks, or the Germanic people are not Anglo-Saxons. And anybody who was not Protestant is not part of the dominant patriarchal group in the United States. However, there's lots of patriarchies all over the place. So for instance, we could be talking about Saudi Arabia right now, in which case WASPs are not the dominant patriarchal group in Saudi Arabia. Males are male of Arab descent who happen to be Islamic, are the dominant ethnic, religious, racial, sex category of people who are part of the dominant group in Saudi Arabia. And so when we look at relationships of power from one society to the next, we have to kind of look more deeply than just surface level, because there's different ethnic markers combined with racial markers, combined with sex categories, combined with sexuality, combined with gender and gender behaviors that all overlap on top of each other. Religion also, which we haven't gotten to yet, but I sure have referred to it a heck of a lot in this chapter. But all of these things overlap to create your identity, your social identity, as being definitely part of the dominant group, partially part of the dominant group, or firmly part of a subordinate group. So there are plenty of females who are white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. However, because they are females, early on in U.S. history, they still couldn't own property, they still couldn't have bank accounts, they still couldn't have the right to vote. All of these things that you hear in history that had to change over time because of protests were because subordinate groups had to fight with the dominant social structure over power that the dominant social group had control of, and essentially did not share or see a way to include other people who didn't share their social characteristics. So here's where identifying against another social group is so very important, because it can categorize you and your social grouping of people as powerful in politics, in the economy, in educational advantage, or not powerful in politics, the economy, educational access, any of these kinds of things. So these power relationships we can study in cultural geography, and in the next couple of videos, we're going to actually look at the way cities can be organized into different ethnic or religious or racial neighborhoods, for instance, and how economics overlaps onto this to maybe create a social landscape, a cultural landscape that has otherness written all over it compared to the dominant group in society. So we will be looking at that next. Text me with questions.